What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to kind of just wax nostalgic a little bit, specifically about World of Warcraft. There's been a lot of that going around recently, partly because information has started to come out about the new Shadowlands expansion that'll be coming out maybe sometime this year, maybe not, I guess we'll find out. And there's a lot of elements of that expansion that are kind of triggering people's nostalgia. But also, WoW Classic has been the thing for a little while now, and talks have started to come out recently about what a potential Burning Crusade server would look like for WoW Classic. So there's a lot of people talking about like what the game looked like back then, what it looks like now, and all this kind of stuff. And to me, WoW nostalgia has always been one of those things that like I can kind of just freely talk about at any time to any person and just talk about it for like an hour. Hopefully this video won't be an hour, but I've been feeling this need to kind of like vent my nostalgia. So I might make a bunch of videos about WoW, but specifically one that I've been thinking a lot about is the Protection Paladin. So I want to talk a little bit about Protection Paladins in Burning Crusade and what they looked like, because by today's standards, it's a really weird class in a lot of ways, and I don't even necessarily mean the way the class itself is designed, but the experience of being a Holy Paladin, not a Holy Paladin, a Protection Paladin, was very, I think, I want to say unique, is very different from like anything else I've ever experienced in the game. And part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because, like, in my mind, any discussion about what a Burning Crusade classic server would look like and what the appeal of that would be like, to me, there's almost no appeal to actually playing one of those servers. And granted, like, I played WoW very, very, very hard when Burning Crusade came out. I was never in a hardcore raiding guild or anything like that, but just circumstances in my life at the time meant that I just played a lot of WoW. And so, like, I have a lot of really fond memories of this period of the time in WoW. And Protection Paladin, like, I fell in love with that character super, super, super hard. So, like I said, I've got a lot of really positive memories, but at the same time, like, the idea of playing a Burning Crusade classic WoW server has, like, no appeal to me, because as much as I have those positive memories, like, the idea of actually playing the Burning Crusade, I feel like, for me at least, it was almost like an exercise in frustration that I don't really have much desire to repeat. But like I said, lots of fun memories, lots of nostalgia, so I kind of... it's not very interesting to do, but to me it's very interesting to think about. So I like to think of this video as kind of like my version of playing WoW Classic Burning Crusade. Instead of just doing it, I'm just going to kind of talk about what the experience was like as a Protection Paladin. So I guess to back this up a little bit, I guess I can start with a very brief overview of how I got to the Protection Paladin to begin with. So I started WoW as a combat rogue in Classic. I didn't play Classic for super duper long, probably about eight or so months, and then Burning Crusade came out. Before that, I didn't mess around with alts too much at all, and when Burning Crusade came out, like I said, I was going very hard on the game at the time, so I got to level cap on my rogue very quickly. I outgeared my guildmates very quickly. I was ready to raid long before any of that they were, and maybe that's overstating it a little bit, but like I did a lot of dungeon runs on my rogue before there was any talk of entering Karazhan. So as a result of that, because my guild was not super hardcore or anything either, what ended up happening is, like so many guilds, we ended up with a lot of gaps in our roster. We were always hurting for tanks and healers. And part of the reason this is so important to me is because for, I want to say, a year or a year and a half or so, maybe, I'm not super clear on the timeline. I don't remember super well. I was actually a raid leader in our guild. I ran 2 Karazhan guilds, or 2 Karazhan runs a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so any holes in our roster were very, like, a really big deal to me. So one of the things that I ended up doing was I ended up rolling a lot of alts, or I guess leveling alts that I created in Classic but never really played too much. I started focusing pretty heavily on a priest. Wasn't super into the priest. It ended up being that what we needed was tanks. So specifically, I remember hearing about people talking about the idea of the paladin being almost like a porcupine spec, the prot spec at least. How, like, their whole thing was that they would reflect damage whenever they got hit. They had a few abilities that would do that. There's the Retribution Aura, there's the Holy Shield, and there was Blessing of Sanctitude, I think it was called. I always just remembered a Blessing of Sank, so I think it was Sanctitude. So I ended up playing around with that at some point on, I think it was like a PTR or something like that. And I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. I ended up playing a paladin a little bit. I started doing all the reading, and then that's when things started to really kind of consolidate for me as like, this is like real. This is something I'm doing. Because the process of playing a Protection Paladin in Burning Crusade was so much more complicated than any other class, at least in my mind. Like, playing a rogue, it's like, yeah, you choose your right spec, you choose your class weightings, or you figure out what your stat weightings are, and then you just kind of go. And, like, it's not too complicated. It's a pretty well understood thing by this point in the game. But Protection Paladins were not something that had really seen too much light before this. In Burning Crusade, the game still kind of operated under this assumption, or maybe not assumption, but under, like, the kind of guiding principle was that, like, hybrids are hybrids. So if you were a class that had a healing spec, you were more or less expected to heal. If you were a tank, you were expected to be a warrior, more or less. So that's kind of the way it was. If you're doing anything else, even in, like, casual play, it wasn't super viable. Obviously people did it, but, you know, what you did in 5-mans is not the same thing that you do in 40-man raiding. It's a very different concept. So the idea of like paladins tanking was, like, not super common at that time. I don't think I had really seen Protection Paladins around that much. I know there were a couple people in my guild who were also kind of becoming interested in it around the same time. But for me, it all started because I was leveling up this paladin, because I liked the idea of being a porcupine, and I very quickly found myself thrust into my own Karazhan raids, because, like, I want to say the same week that I hit level 70 on my Protection Paladin, we just didn't have a tank sign up for Karazhan that week. So basically from that week on, I was in Karazhan full-time on my Paladin, and that's kind of where my, like, love for the character grew. So before I get into it too much, let's kind of go over some of the things that make a Protection Paladin work in Burning Crusade. The first thing that comes to mind for me is just the fact that the Protection Paladin rotation at the time was insanely dead. Like, there was almost nothing to it, which is a big part of the reason why the idea of a Burning Crusade classic server is not that interesting to me. I can't imagine playing anything but a Protection Paladin in Burning Crusade, but actually doing it is just seems so unfun at this point. So what does a Protection Paladin do? You know, you've got all your buffs and stuff like that you apply before the raid. You know, you've got your blessings. Every paladin has their blessings. You got to figure out your blessing assignments with the rest of your raid. You know, oh, I'll just put kings on everybody in the raid. Or wait, no, I'm protection, so I would probably be putting blessing of sanctuary. Is it sanctuary? Did I say sanctity before? I would probably be putting Sank on the tanks, which would include myself. But, you know, maybe I'd be putting wisdom on all the other paladins and then doing a lesser sank on myself. Maybe I'm doing like might on all the rogues and the other paladin is like doing kings on the rogues or something like that. But, you know, you had to figure out your blessings. You figure out your auras among the group. But once you actually got into combat, all Protection Paladins could do essentially was you had Consecrate on an 8-second cooldown, you had Holy Shield on a 10-second cooldown, you had your seals, which typically you were using Seal of Righteousness, which, well, I guess that's another topic that we'll get into in a little bit also. But you had your seal, you know, you could use your damage seal, you had Seal of Light, you had Seal of Mana, or Seal of Wisdom I think it was called. And each of those was like, whenever you hit the target, you do something, whether it's, you know, healing yourself, restoring your mana, or just doing extra holy damage. Nowadays, you would think, well, obviously you want to use the seal that gives you self-healing, at least in some situations, but that's almost never the case in Burning Crusade, just by the nature of the way that the Paladin generated threat, which again we'll get into that in a minute. So you had your seal and you had your judgments. So depending on what seal you had active, whenever you would cast judgment on... How long was the cooldown on judgment? I'm not actually sure. I want to say it was 12 seconds? Maybe it was 10 seconds. But whatever the case, the idea is like, essentially these are the three abilities that you have. Consecrate, Holy Shield, and Judgment. And each of them has around like 8 to 10 second cooldowns. So what do you do the rest of the time? You can reapply your seal. Your seal gets consumed every time you use your Judgment ability, but your seal is also off cooldown. So for the most part, a lot of people would actually just have a macro where their Judgment would automatically reapply their seal, which, I mean, that's cool, I guess, but that doesn't help you fill the dead time in between your abilities. Like, you had your Avenger's Shield, obviously, that existed in the Burning Crusade. That was like the reason to roll a Protection Paladin for a lot of people. But the issue with Avenger's Shield is that it had a cast time, and if you were tanking, then you are not casting, because while you're casting, you have a chance to be hit by crushing blows because you can't block. Just because you can't block? Was there any other reason? I don't remember. But like, casting is a bad thing. So like, you're taking more damage while you're casting. So like, you don't want to be casting while a mob is actively attacking you. In theory, you could do stuff like, if the enemy was a slow attacking mob, you could try to thread your Avenger Shield in between melee swings. But with the way that the servers worked at the time, that was really unreliable. So you're basically like just hoping for a random chance that it would actually work. So it's not really something you would ideally do, unless you're doing like garbage content that nobody cares about. But like, other than that, there wasn't really anything else you could do. You had your Hammer of Justice if you need to stun something, I guess. You had some like utility spells, like Blessing of Sanctuary, Hand of Protection, Blessing of Protection, Hand of Protection, Blessing of Protection. Are those the same thing? No? I don't remember. But you had like Hand of Freedom. All your like utilities, all of your cooldowns and all that kind of stuff, but your core rotation was very, very simplistic. So the act of actually playing a Protection Paladin was not very like engaging. And it was also like, there was a lot of stuff that was like worked very heavily against you. Like I was just saying about Avenger's Shield and how like being a caster is a bad thing. Like, just the fact that you are a paladin was very much kind of to your detriment. Kind of like I was saying earlier, like hybrids kind of were still getting the shaft at this point in Burning Crusade. In WoW in general, I guess. So, I guess like a couple things specifically that this happens with. One is the fact that you're a paladin, which means that you use mana, but you're not a holy paladin, so like you don't have any real mana utilities to help you out, for the most part at least. your mana pool was very small, your spells use a lot of it, and getting it back was not very easy. Even with Judgment of Wisdom on the target and stuff like that, there was not a whole lot you could do. The main way for you to get your mana back was to actually receive healing. We had like a talent or something, or if you had a Shadow Priest in your group, that was also like godsend. But you would never put a Shadow Priest with your tanks. You would always want your Shadow Priest in the same group as your healers. Or maybe even Warlocks or something. Maybe? Was that ever done? I think it was probably usually with the healers. But yeah, I know that I always put the Shadow Priest in my group in our Karazhan raids, but I mean, that's just me, right? So mana was a hard thing, and because mana required you to be getting hit so much, it meant that if you were ever supposed to be the off tank in an encounter, it was almost impossible to actually stay high on the threat table. So for encounters where you had to stay in second place, like Prot Paladins tanking on like Gruul or something like that. Gruul had a mechanic, I think it was called like a Hateful Strike or something like that, where he would attack the second person on the aggro list. Paladins had a really hard time staying in the second slot because like you're not getting hit often enough to really like get your mana back, and if you don't have that mana income, all you can really do is like melee the target with your seals active and do like judgments and stuff like that. If you're like using your consecration or using your Avenger's Shield without a constant stream of mana coming in, you would go out of mana really quickly, and there's not really a whole lot that you could do about it. There's also some encounters where just the fact that you had mana was a bad thing. There was one encounter I remember specifically in Serpent Shrine Cavern, where I think the mechanic was the boss would... Was it a debuff, or did he just do like a crazy amount of damage to someone in the raid who... But it would only target people who had mana. I don't remember the boss's name or what the mechanic was exactly. I want to say it was like a Tide Hunter or some sort, and I think it was like a group fight with like 5 guys or something like that. We never spent tons of time in Serpent Shrine Cavern, but there would always be random encounters like that, where the fact that you had mana was always to your detriment. And so like there's just a lot of things that that tanks were expected to do that paladins couldn't do. There were some encounters in some places where your tanks were expected to actually even have spell reflect. So like working around that obviously was not so great for non-warriors. But anyways, like all of that is almost like beside the point. Because in a lot of ways, obviously the reason people played Protection Paladins is because they had their strengths as well. The main thing was just the fact that Protection Paladins were so good at AoE tanking. Our Consecration was super strong, our Holy Shield was pretty good, and basically what we could do was, the main thing was Consecration really, is any enemy standing in range of us would take enough holy damage, and we had such a huge multiplier on our holy damage threat generation, that once your paladin got kind of geared up, it was actually really, really easy to build threat on a target as long as you could like actively use your abilities, so you had enough mana to actually do that. And by endgame, like the amount of threat that Protection Paladins could put out was actually pretty insane. But the problem is, it was all spell damage. So we'll get to gear in a minute. But I guess the other thing that Protection Paladins really had to their advantage when it comes to AoE was, I guess actually a couple. One was Avenger's Shield, which was an AoE pull, which was not very common at that point. If you wanted to do like really controlled pulls, a lot of times what you would need is a hunter to misdirect. But the Protection Paladin could hit 3 ranged targets with their shield, and it would also silence them. So that remains a really, really nice utility to this day. But at the time, it was even more cool, really handy, especially in like heroics and stuff like that. But also, the way that itemization worked in Burning Crusade, it was pretty different from the way it is now. But the concept of like blocking was a big deal back then, especially for paladins. And one of the things that we had, one of the big advantages we had from Holy Shield was the fact that it made us really good at blocking. We had a really high block chance, but we could also get really high block values. So what block value was literally just a number that like determined how much of a hit you were able to block when you blocked it. So if a hit connected with you, and you had a piece of gear with 50 block value on it, you would take 50 less damage. Which, in AoE situations where you have lots of mobs that are all hitting you for small amounts of damage, large amounts of block value make you actually very, very, very tanky. So that made Paladins a really, really ideal tank for AoE. So it became a niche that was actually really useful, and I know that for a lot of progression raiders, like high-end bleeding edge raiders, they would do stuff like have Holy Paladins spec into Prot for like one specific fight, or they would just like pretend they're Prot and just do it in Holy Gear or whatever, which is actually kind of a cool idea. You could do stuff like if you activated Righteous Fury as a Paladin, even if you weren't tanking, you could heal, and your heal would actually generate extra aggro on enemies, so like you didn't even have to actually do damage to them. I remember I would use that strategy a lot on Alar, because you could put out some heals, and that would generate some additional aggro, so the ads that were like coming down the ramps, they would want to run to you instead of running to the healers. So that was pretty handy as well. So yeah, like Prot Paladins could definitely do some pretty cool stuff, and they had a really nice niche. They were really good for heroics. They were really good for Zul'Aman. I love Zul'Aman so much. It's a really good dungeon, but also Protection Paladins were just really freaking good there. And they were really good at Hyjal as well. Like, Protection Paladins were like the king of Hyjal trash. I've probably been playing some of the videos behind this. You may notice that I'm like surprisingly high up on the damage meter for a 25-man group in these on Hyjal trash. I remember specifically there was a shield. I think it came from Sporgar rep, and it had block value on it, I think, but it also had a proc where like any enemy who you block their attack, it would like put a dot on them or something. So like that combined with Consecration and Retribution Aura and Blessing of Sank and Holy Shield, like you would generate so much damage just by pressing 2 buttons and standing still for like 8 seconds that it was crazy. But I guess getting into gear a little bit, this I think was one of the most interesting things about playing a Paladin, a Protection Paladin in Burning Crusade, and this existed to a lesser degree in Wrath of the Lich King as well, but at this point I think the concept, I want to say since Wrath, I could be wrong about that, I think it existed in Cataclysm as well, but I don't remember exactly. But the big idea in Burning Crusade was this concept of the hit table, or the attack table, I guess. I think it was called the attack table. And it's this idea that when an enemy attacks, there are certain possible things that can happen from that attack. It could be a hit, it could be... I guess it could be a crit. It could be a crushing blow. I don't know if crushing blows are even something that still exists in the game. But like, it could be that, you could dodge it, you could parry it, all these things. And the way that the game determined which one of those happened is it would just basically do a roll from 0 to 100, and which one of those it did depended on where in that range it fell. So basically each range of numbers would represent a different result, but what result it represented depended on your character's stats. So I think At the top of the table would be stuff like dodge and parry, which would completely negate the damage. And then below that would be block, which would partially negate damage. And then below that would be stuff like crushing blow and other results, basically, that as a tank are very not ideal. So there's this idea in Burning Crusade of pushing crushing blows off of the attack table, which essentially would mean that if you had enough stats, you could manipulate the attack table so that crushing blows were not even on it anymore. And this also applied to critical hits, actually, because at the time, how did it work exactly? I think it was basically that crushing blows and critical hits were both possible, and warriors had a protection ability that would give them 6% crit reduction, I think, but paladins and druids did not, I believe. So we had to work extra hard to kind of make up that gap through gear. Druids didn't really have that luxury. They kind of just had to get as much armor as they could and just kind of tank through it, so to speak. But for paladins, our goal was to get enough combined avoidance, parry, dodge, block, and defense rating also, because defense rating was a stat at the time. So you needed enough defense rating to get to 6%. Oh man, I'm getting so ahead of myself. So defense rating essentially gave you a little bit of everything, but it also reduced your chance to be critical hit. So you needed enough defense rating to have 6% crit reduction, and then you needed to have enough to push crushing blows off the table. So like dodge and parry were really good ways of getting, of avoiding damage overall, but they don't actually do as much to manipulate the attack table because an equal amount of dodge or parry is going to give you less of that stat than block. Block and even defense rating would both give you a pretty good amount of like more attack table coverage. So like, say like 5 defense rating, or not defense, 5 parry might give you like 0.2% parry chance, but 5 block rating might give you like 0.4% block chance. I don't remember if it's exactly double, but the idea is early on when you're gearing up a Prot Paladin, you actually wanted block more than dodge and parry, even though they were worse stats, because it would push crushing blows off the attack table entirely. And I think a crushing blow would do like 2.5 times damage or something like that. So it was a pretty big deal. Like, even in Karazhan, if you're fighting, say, Prince Malchezaar, you could legitimately get one-shot by a stray crushing blow on that fight, because he just does that much damage. So it was pretty important to have this more or less in place, ideally before you even start raiding Karazhan. I didn't have that luxury. I was decently geared, but there are definitely some slots that I didn't have good options for at that time. I remember specifically running... I think it was just normal Botanica, like chain running, like doing like 10 runs a day for like a week, because I wanted to get the Paladin shoulders from the second last boss. But I never got them. I did get them eventually, but it was like way later, like in the Cataclysm or something like that, when I was soloing the dungeon or something. But yeah, so gearing up a Protection Paladin was like a huge... I won't say it was a huge headache, but it was also like really interesting, kind of like diving into the mechanics of how this all worked. And just the fact that like manipulating all of these numbers was like a requirement for making this work at all. Like you had to do that as like, that was the bare minimum. Like, you could do it, you could tank without doing that, but, like, to do a good job of it, it's like, this was how you beat level 0, is you figure out all of this shit. And you had to do all of this extra legwork because, like, the game was essentially working against you. It was basically saying, like, we kind of don't want you to tank, but if you jump through all these hoops, then you can do it. And that's just the start of the gearing woes, because on top of that, there's the fact that Protection Paladins were kind of a niche that was never meant to exist, really, it feels like. Of course, it's not like this is like new, like a new concept for Paladins at this time. I mean, I'm sure all the old school people are well aware of the meme of like Paladins wearing dresses because they had better stats, and when you're healing, nobody cares about your armor. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of an idea that was carried forward into the Burning Crusade to some degree. I don't think we really had Paladins wearing dresses in Burning Crusade much, but just the idea of like there not really being enough gear to satisfy every spec was kind of a thing. So I mentioned earlier that the way that Paladins generated threat was almost entirely through holy damage. So our spell power was actually a really big deal at the time. And keep in mind also that this was at a time when, like now, if you're playing the game, spell power is just kind of like a catch-all stat that improves all spell effects. But at the time, spell power, I don't know if it, I think it existed. Yeah, it definitely existed, but like, for the most part, spell stats were much more broken up. So you had stats, you would have some gear that would explicitly increase healing, you would have some gear that would explicitly increase spell damage. Yeah, so I guess they didn't have spell power. You would even have some gear that would explicitly increase certain elements. So at the beginning of Burning Crusade, some of the best or very sought after gear for casters were like tailoring cloth. I think it was like a nether weave and ember weave and stuff like that. That would like explicitly increase like shadow damage or fire damage or like what have you. So like it was getting the stat that increased your spell damage was not as simple as it is now. Some way through the Burning Crusade they implemented a system where if anything had healing, bonus healing on it, it would give you, I think, 1/3 of that as spell damage, which I don't think it ever helped me at all, even though like I had a full set of plate healing gear, because like as a Protection Paladin you had to have your off healing gear, because even on like raid bosses that you were tanking, sometimes you would have to switch into off healing, but because you couldn't do off DPS, like you would be doing like 50 DPS or something. But yeah, so like I had a full set of healing gear, and even then I don't think any of that had enough stats on it to be better for me than what I was using. So effectively, all of this to say that like we couldn't just put on healing plate. Like that was not an option. So essentially what this means is that in order to increase our threat generation as a Protection Paladin, our only good sources of spell damage were from caster weapons, from caster shields, which existed thanks to elemental shamans, and Protection Paladin tier gear. And even then, I don't think all of the Protection Paladin tier gear actually had spell damage on it. So between that and also the fact that like spell damage is something that took up space on gear, it kind of created this scenario where like, for one, like we didn't have spell power on all of our gear, because like in the end of the day we're still a tank. We still need our other stats. So like we can't just say, okay, well every slot is spell damage, I don't need any dodge, we're just gonna be fine. So it created this really weird trade-off where like obviously every tank spec has a scenario where you can gear for more avoidance, you can gear for more threat, whatever. You can have different gear sets for different scenarios. But for Paladins it felt like it was like an entirely different scenario, because for one thing you're using such a a mishmash of gear. Like, I know that for many Protection Paladins, including myself, the go-to when you started playing your character was you would try and get the Merciless Gladiator... I don't remember its actual name, but it was the Season 2 spell power weapon. It was a mace, so you could tell someone was a Protection Paladin when they were walking around with that glowy purple one-handed mace, because that was just what everyone got. It was pretty easy to get Merciless Gladiator gear at the time. I don't think you even need to do arenas. I think you could just do it through... I want to say you could do it through Honor. I have memories of doing Alterac Valley. I actually really liked playing PvP on my Prod Paladin for a long time. But yeah, so that was like the best weapon for most people until you could get to I think the next thing that people would go to typically was there was a mace that dropped off of Highjaw Trash. I never got that mace. I remember it looked like a swirly cone kind of thing, but almost like a cotton candy kind of idea. But I never ended up using that. But yeah, so like we would have this weird mishmash of gear just to kind of make it work. And kind of what was interesting was over the course of the expansion, they actually added more things for us. So a lot of the gear that was added in Zul'Aman was very Prot Paladin friendly. So we would Prot Paladins would end up having a lot of gear from Badges of Justice, which didn't exist when Burning Crusade launched. But that was kind of like, I think that's part of why Prot Paladins became like a heroic dungeon kings as well, right? Because so much of the good plate casting gear actually came from getting Badges of Justice, which you got from killing raid bosses and heroic bosses, heroic dungeon bosses. So I was doing heroic Mechanar like every single day of the week to get those Badges of Justice, to get that Zandalari casting plate, because that was like the only place that it existed. I remember that, like, I was never, like I mentioned at the start, I was never in a hardcore raiding guild. I would do a decent amount of like pugs and stuff like that, of tier 6 content, and our guild got some tier 6 kills as well. We got a few kills in Highjaw, we got a few kills in Black Temple, but I think the highest item level gear that I got in the game was a couple of items out of Black Temple. I got like, I want to say it was like was it a bracer? No, it was boots off of, what was his name? High Warlord Nagentis? I think it was the first boss actually in that dungeon. But the other piece that I got was a healer shield off of Supremus. That I absolutely loved that shield, because it was a tier 6 item and it was a shield, so I could wear it on my back and show off to people. It's like, look at my Black Temple gear. And it was a healer shield, but like it would work for me. And I would just tell people I want it for the threat. And it was perfect. I loved it. Anyways, I guess I'm just trying to think now of like other little tidbits that are interesting. I think one that's kind of interesting is, since we're talking about items, itemization and gear and stuff like that, I remember very vividly that my bag space in Burning Crusade was super duper low. Partly because I was a pack rat, partly because I liked carrying all of my like current gear around with me instead of having it in the bank. But being a tank, and being a Protection Paladin tank especially, was always like super kind of weird for this, I found, because I carried around a lot of gear sets. Like I mentioned, I carried around a complete set of healing gear. I carried around a complete set of DPS gear. So sometimes, depending on what was happening in the fight, I might switch to my healing weapon, I might switch to my two-hander. But there's also, I had a whole bunch of different trinkets for different situations. I'd have different pieces of gear that I would swap in and out, because if I needed to switch a trinket around, maybe that would like put me underneath the not the defense cap, but like underneath the crushing cap or something like that. So maybe I'd have to like swap around gear somewhere else so that I could get that defense back elsewhere. And also I remember I had I guess it was 2 complete sets of resistance gear, but I had a bunch of pieces of nature resist, I had a bunch of pieces of frost resist, and I had a full set of fire resist. So I had the frost and the nature resist for, what was his name? Hydroxus? There's the one fight in Serpent Shrine. I think it was the first boss. He would like go back and forth between, was it Hydros? Whatever his name was. But he would go back and forth between nature and frost. So you kind of needed a set of gear for like both. And on that fight, I think it was mostly fine. The fact that like putting on all of that resist gear made it essentially impossible to cover the attack table. So like you would kind of just have to make the best trade-offs possible. And I had the full set of fire resist gear because I tanked a Netheron. His name was, yeah, a Netheron. Or not a Netheron, I tanked a Netheron's Infernals. So in the Netheron fight, my job was to gather up all of the Infernals and pull them away from the raid. And there was one Druid healer who was responsible for healing me. What else did Protection Paladins have? I guess in addition to Avenger's Shield, they also had Exorcism. Oh, Exorcism! Man, Exorcism as a Holy Paladin, as a Protection Paladin, was so cool. Any fight that you could use it on. Any fight you could use those, or Hammer of Wrath was really cool too. But I think at the time they both had casting time still. So like you couldn't use them when they were tanking. You were tanking, but oh, what was that other one? There was one other spell. I think it was called Holy Wrath. I don't remember if we actually had that in Burning Crusade. I think that was a Wrath of the Lich King thing, but that was also only, I think it was usable on demons, undead, and I think there was like a, maybe it was in Cataclysm, there was like a glyph or something that would let it hit Dragonkin, I think? Something like that. But yeah, all these spells that were only usable in certain situations. I remember in Wrath of the Lich King, against the vampire dudes, there's the one fight with, in ICC, with the 3 vampire guys. I remember always thinking it was so funny that you could use Hammer of Wrath to pull them, because they had like the shared health pool, so like only one of them would have health at a time. So the other 2 would be completely, like you could execute them. It wouldn't kill them, it wouldn't like deal damage to their actual health pool, but you could use your execute to get like snap aggro on them. So that was always kind of fun. But that had nothing to do with Burning Crusade. But yeah, all of those had casting time, so like they weren't super usable. Although I do remember in tanking Karazhan, I tanked Karazhan for so long that like my paladin was so geared up by the time we kind of stopped or kind of slowed down on doing Karazhan runs, that I specifically remember like taking off pieces of gear in order to like, what do I do? I would take off some gear. I would never take off anything that had spell damage on it. I remember I had a really nice crafted dress that I would put on because, for one, it had some spell damage on it, and for 2, it would reduce my armor and I guess also my avoidance a little bit, so that I would actually take more damage. Because the way that paladins worked at the time, because you relied so much on incoming healing, that you would actually have problems where if you were fighting something that wasn't doing enough damage to you, you would actually go out of mana so quickly that like putting on a dress in Karazhan was like allowing things to do a little bit more damage to you, so you could actually like have enough healing coming in that you could actually keep up your mana. So I remember that being fun, like outgearing Karazhan so much, which it's not hard to do, but like running through Karazhan in a dress. I think I would still take the dress off for like Prince Malchezaar and stuff like that, but I remember, oh geez, actually even tanking Prince Malchezaar was such a hassle as a paladin. He was hard as for anyone to tank, but because paladins had like such a disadvantage, I remember it took quite a few tries for us to actually be able to down him with me tanking, which was not a great feeling. But I remember the biggest problems were always on his phase 2, where he took out his double axes. And I remember tanking, this is a good example of how weird tanking on a paladin was. I think warriors kind of did this a little bit as well, but what I remember was, for one thing, when we started getting to the point where I would tank on Prince, I actually changed up my talents, because I took out points in Reckoning, I think it was, because Reckoning would cause you to get double hits on the enemy, and one of the big things with Prince was that his attack speed, like his attacks were so big and his attack speed was so high that he just had a lot of like really spiky damage. And one of the things he could do was the way that enemy attacks worked at the time, I don't know if they still work this way, was if you attacked, the enemy could also parry, which is where expertise became like a thing and became a good stat for everyone, but especially tanks. Because I think tanks got double benefit from expertise, because expertise also affected something else, but DPS didn't need to worry about the parry part because they're always attacking from the back. But yeah, so tanks could get expertise to mitigate the chance of being parried, but the way it worked at the time, at least, was when someone parried, their next attack would happen, I want to say immediately, or like much quicker. I think it like reduced the swing time by half or something like that. So for Prince, at least, that was like a really, really bad thing. So a lot of tanks would actually just stop attacking during that phase. So I know for paladins especially, that was like the strategy, because we had the advantage, at least, of with Consecrate and Holy Shield alone, you could still generate enough threat that you'd actually probably be fine on threat. Like, after going through the entire first phase, your lead would probably be high enough that you could just use Holy Shield and do like reflective holy damage, and Consecrate, which doesn't require attacking the enemy. And between the two of those, you could still output a decent amount of threat. So you'd literally like hit the escape buttons and stop attacking Prince entirely for that entire phase. And in addition to that, I would also switch over to, I had an avoidance weapon, the Sun Eater from Heroic Mechanar. I had that with like an agility enchant on it, I think. And it's literally just like, give me more dodge, just give me like a 1% better chance of surviving this fight. That was some crazy shit to do for like. Can you imagine today having a fight where like the optimal strategy for the tank is to literally stop doing anything for the entire phase? Like, I say literally, it's not literally. I didn't literally stop doing anything, but like I stopped attacking. Not that paladins didn't much, like, for a rotation at the time anyways, but, like, that whole concept is just, like, crazy in the context of today. And yet, like, ironically enough, I still had, like, a million different things on my bars. I guess some of that was just the fact that, like, we still had a lot of, like, utility things that we could do. I definitely got a lot of fun out of, like, divine interventioning people and stuff like that. It's always kind of handy to be able to DI people as the tank. I remember specifically also, I had a bunch of different UI layouts. I was like changing my UI pretty constantly during that time. but some of them I remember I had slots where I would literally just have like a row of like literally every rank of consecration just in a row, so that like if my mana was low enough that I couldn't afford to do one rank, I would just like down rank until I had enough mana, basically. Or if my mana was starting to get low, I would just cast like rank 1 or something like that. Like, down ranking was kind of like a thing that people still did in general in Burning Crusade, but like, it's so weird to think about doing that on a tank, let alone like doing it at all. But yeah, like, mana was so tight as a Prot Paladin that, and Consecrate was so important that that was a whole thing. I guess even just the idea that like the whole concept of a Protection Paladin was basically having a Consecrate up around you, not at all times. I think it was like, was it constant? Was it literally? I can't remember if it was 8-second cooldown, 8-second duration. I feel like it was. But yeah, so basically like what I was getting at with that was just the fact that like while that was going on, there was basically never any chance of crowd control going on. So I remember like adopting that as my like, I think it was pretty common among Protection Paladins of like, that kind of became like a mantra for us is CC equals constant consecration, because we would much rather just tank more things than crowd control anything. And I guess one thing that I keep forgetting to bring up was on the topic of like mana and stuff. I was playing an Alliance Paladin, and one of the things that made life harder for us was the fact that we didn't have Seal of Blood. I don't remember exactly if it was ever how like precisely it was ever determined how Seal of Blood compared against Seal of Vengeance or Seal of Righteousness as far as like raw like DPS for a Protection Paladin. For the most part, it didn't really matter. Like, tanks were not really expected to contribute significantly to DPS at the time. Like, maybe that was different for like progression rating and stuff like that, but at least in the content I was doing, that was not expected really, to that a tank would contribute significant DPS. But obviously, like, DPS equals threat, especially for when it comes to Holy Paladin damage, or Holy damage for Protection Paladins. There we go, did it. But there's also the fact that Seal of Blood did like a little bit of damage to yourself as well. So that would create like a requirement for like a little bit of healing. So that would help your mana intake as well, which in turn would like also like further give you more ability to do more spells and generate more threat in that way as well. So I've to this day I have never cast Seal of Blood. I think the spell was actually removed in Missa Pandaria ? Maybe it's Cataclysm. But yeah, so like that was always a thing. We would typically use Seal of Righteousness as Alliance. I think Seal of Vengeance was considered higher DPS, but it required stacking up 5 stacks of the dot, and it's not very like consistent whether they would stay on or not. So like even if you had a melee uptime for the entire duration, it would still be possible for the dot to fall off sometimes. It was such a bad seal. I wanted it to work so bad, because having like a ticking holy dot on your enemy was so cool to me. And I especially was really into the idea of seal weaving, or seal twisting, or whatever. I've heard different terms for it, but the idea of like stacking up the Seal of Vengeance dot on the enemy and then switching to Seal of Righteousness to get attacks of that while the dot is up. I would even do that sometimes if I would expect that like if the enemy is going to live for like 20 seconds longer, but and I might like maybe 20 seconds is a bad number, but if I knew that the enemy is going to not last, was going to survive for like a medium amount of time, then I would like build up the Seal of Vengeance dot and then just switch to Seal of Righteousness and accept that I'm never going to refresh that dot. So even if I was not like switching back and forth in between them, I would still have that period of like having both damage sources active. And like, yeah, like the community, I think, more or less proved out that like switching back and forth between seals was not really worth it. But like in my mind, like I wanted that to work so bad. So like that concept was always really interesting to me. I know that one of the things that people have talked about the most about potential changes that might be good to make to the potential WoW Classic Burning Crusade server is just giving Seal of Blood to all Paladins. And that's definitely a change that I couldn't get behind, because I think that if that was a server that I was interested in joining, then having Seal of Blood there would make the prospect of playing an Alliance Prot Paladin a lot more tantalizing. And even more so, the idea of potentially having both Seal of Blood and Seal of Vengeance and being able to switch back and forth between those, like I'd have to wonder like how effective that is. It probably wouldn't be any more effective, but like it's interesting to think about. It's like a possibility that's never existed in WoW before. So like maybe that could be maybe that could be a thing. Who knows? But anyways, I think that I have ranted and raved about this enough for now. I've somehow talked about Protection Paladins for like an hour, and I'm sure there's other stuff that I wanted to say that I didn't get to bring up, but it's just a really big topic. It represents a really big part of my time in WoW. It represents, you know, a time when WoW was a very, very big focus in my life, and yeah, it's just this is the kind of stuff that like it presented interesting challenges that really kind of clicked with my brain in a really unique way that has never happened in the game since then. I wouldn't say that it was the best time for Protection Paladins by any means. I had a lot of fun tanking in Wrath of the Lich King and especially in Cataclysm. I haven't really played around with it too much since then. I played a little bit of Warlords of Draenor, but my Paladin has mostly gone unattended since then. But yeah, that's getting entirely off topic. Burning Crusade Prot Paladin. Super great, but at the same time, fucking trash, dude. Play literally anything else. But anyways, I think that's about it for me, so I guess I'll catch you later.